Over the course of the past few years, Star Wars fans have been absolutely buried beneath a steadily growing pile of live-action Star Wars series. While the output for these series has been pretty staggering, however, it's not exactly a secret that the quality of these series has been pretty variable. On the one hand, we've gotten some of the best Star Wars content of all time as part of this wave, most notably Andor, and on the other hand, we've also gotten a lot of mediocre content too. The contrast can be jarring in some cases, and that contrast is what we're going to be looking at in this video. Specifically, we're going to be talking about writing, and we'll be comparing two of Star Wars' recent live-action offerings to do so. On the one hand, we have the deeply underrated Skeleton Crew, which is one of the best written Star Wars series we've ever gotten. On the other hand, we have The Acolyte, which is not that. These two series happen to provide excellent opportunities for comparison, and in this video, we'll be looking at both of them for what we think Star Wars screenwriters should do more of and what they should avoid. Before we get into things, there's one thing we'd like to make very clear. This isn't a hate video. We like to keep things civil here at Geetsly's, and we're here to have a reasonable conversation about Star Wars, nothing else. While we mostly have praise for Skeleton Crew and criticism for The Acolyte in this video, we are only focusing on one particular aspect of storytelling where Skeleton Crew shines and The Acolyte really struggles. We also reserve the right to criticize Skeleton Crew and give The Acolyte praise where due. After all, Skeleton Crew isn't perfect, and we think there's things to like about The Acolyte as well. We encourage you to share your own thoughts on these topics in the comments below, and we also ask that you engage respectfully with people you disagree with. There are people who enjoyed The Acolyte, after all. A community poll we did back when it was airing showed that, among those in our audience who watched the show, there was roughly an even split between those who disliked the series and those who at least considered it decent. Let's also keep in mind that there's a difference between criticism and hate. The purpose of criticism is to spur future improvement, and it's a necessary part of any creative process. Just keep an open mind as you go into the comment section and be respectful to your fellow Star Wars fans. Additionally, this isn't going to be a complete overview of either series. We're just looking at a few aspects of storytelling that the two series provide good examples for. Nonetheless, there'll be extensive spoilers, and we'll also be assuming that you're familiar with the plots of both series throughout this video, so if you're interested in watching The Acolyte and/or Skeleton Crew, you should probably do that before watching this video. If you'd be interested in a more comprehensive critique of either series, feel free to let us know. And with all that out of the way, let's begin.
Attention, Sergeant on deck!
We'll start with what's far and away the biggest issue with The Acolyte: the pacing. A lot of recent Star Wars series have struggled with this, and we suspect that the problem partly stems from the format. Series like Kenobi, for instance, are really just a movie that's been stretched out into a short series, and the pacing takes a real hit from that. But with The Acolyte, the pacing is downright catastrophic, both for the individual episodes and the series as a whole. Even in serialized shows, every episode should tell a complete plot, even if that plot is meant to function as a piece of a greater story. If an episode's job is primarily to provide build-up to the next episode, it should still have some resolution, even if the next episode will end up using that as a starting point for its own narrative. Every episode should make significant advancements for characters' arcs and/or for the overall plot. Put another way, if you're going to be releasing episodes a week at a time, then you should be getting viewers invested in each individual episode as well as the overall story. The Skeleton Crew does quite well in this regard. That show is also serialized, but nonetheless, every episode has a complete plot with its own premise, development, climax, resolution, and all the rest, even though the episodes all feed into a larger story. Consider episode 6, Zero Friends Again. You could consider this part 2 of a 2-part arc, as it completes the broader story of the Skeleton Crew's adventures on Lanupa. The episode plot is built on the end of episode 5, which sees Jodna Narwood betray the kids and usurp control of the Onyx Cinder, even as his old pirate crew attacks the Lanupa resort. But even though Zero Friends Again is only part of a broader story, and even though it relies on the context of a previous episode to establish its own plot, it still tells a complete story. The episode's A-plot tells a poignant, character-driven story of the At-Aden kids struggling to get along, work together, and sympathize with one another in spite of the pressures they're under and the danger of their situation, while the B-plot has Jod escaping execution after being captured by the pirates and regaining a measure of influence within his old crew. The episode contains plenty of payoffs and resolution. You've got kids making up and working together to escape Lanupa, you've got Jod winning a stay of execution, and you get a lot of smaller payoffs along the way as well, such as when Win successfully repairs KB's cybernetics. There's significant character development on all fronts, and the episode is complete enough that you can watch it on its own, have a good time, and walk away satisfied, if eager for more. Every episode of Skeleton Crew functions the same way. At the same time though, Zero Friends Again is still part of a greater story, and it has the added burden of being the episode before the start of the finale arc. It doesn't just have to tell a complete story, it has to build up hype for the finale as well. It does that primarily through the B-plot, which introduces the viewer to the imminent threat of the pirate raid on At-Aden, raising the stakes higher than they've ever been in the series. Compare that to the episode Day from The Acolyte. The vast majority of this episode is dedicated to building up the series' next episode, Night, and there's very little in Day that really stands out on its own. Osha's side of the story is mostly just a hike through the woods without anything to really build tension or advance the story. We learn more about some of the characters along the way, which is valuable, and there's a touch of character development as well, but it doesn't go anywhere within the confines of this particular episode. The story's a little more complete on May's side of things. Her part of the plot is also a hike through the woods, but unlike in Osha's side of the story, this hike is used to spur significant character development for May. Now that she knows that Osha is alive, May wavers in her dedication to her mission and ultimately decides to abandon it and turn herself into the Jedi. This does bring some resolution, but not enough to carry the whole episode on, especially since Osha's plot has no such payoff. Almost all the payoff for Day comes in the next episode, Night, which is a problem for a series that releases episodes once per week. Because of all this, Day is a painfully slow episode, and it doesn't offer the viewer much apart from some really lovely scenery and a few insights into the main cast. This problem isn't limited to Day either. Large parts of the series' first 3 episodes all drag in this way, with all the plot advancement, character development, and payoff crammed into the final third of the episode. The 5th episode avoids this issue. The 6th, although the episode is still a slow burn, it's something that works for the episode individually, although it's a bit questionable in a series that's already moving slowly. Pacing issues return for the last 2 episodes, although they aren't as bad in this regard as the episodes in the show's first half. The Acolyte doesn't just struggle with pacing on an episode-to-episode basis though, it struggles with it on a series scale too. The whole first half of the series is slow, while some elements of the plot in the second half, such as Osha's fall to the dark side, happen too fast. The first 4 episodes of the series are all largely spent laying groundwork, a lot of which is ultimately unnecessary and just serves to drag things out. The series would have worked a whole lot better if the first 5 episodes or so were condensed into 3, giving each episode more to work with and making the plot advance faster. Perhaps the material from episode 3 could have been sprinkled among the events of the first 2 episodes as flashbacks, while Day could be significantly shortened and combined with Night, which had most of the payoff from Day anyway. The last 3 episodes could have been kept as they are, or perhaps some of the arcs within them, such as Osha's fall, could have been extended to better flesh them out. The Acolyte might have even worked a lot better as a movie instead of a series. Compare again to Skeleton Crew. Skeleton Crew lays out almost all its groundwork in the first 2 episodes, and the rest is laid at the start of episode 3. Those episodes keep the viewer along for the ride with significant character development early on and regular plot advancements. The plot moves at a steady pace, except for the start of the first episode, which takes a little bit more time to get the viewer acquainted with the characters and their world, which ends up being necessary. Once all the groundwork is laid, the story proceeds at a fairly quick pace, with each episode advancing the plot in some major way. There are no slow points, and nothing feels like it's being drawn out for the sake of runtime. Each part of the story takes just as long as it needs to. It's worth pointing out though, that Skeleton Crew is a bit of an anomaly in this respect. A lot of Star Wars series have the same pacing problems as The Acolyte, to the point where we suspect that it's less an issue with the writers and more a production problem, although that's just speculation on our part. Whatever the cause, The Acolyte and many other series are plagued with plots that are stretched too thin, unnecessarily divided up into short weekly episodes rather than released in a few longer parts or even as one long movie. It hurts the quality of these projects significantly, and it would be better if these series were either paced like a show or just released as a film. But that's enough about pacing for now. It's time to move on to another aspect of these two series' writing, which is how well they keep track of and resolve each of the various elements of their stories. This is something where Skeleton Crew has an advantage just by virtue of its scope. Skeleton Crew is a side story rather than a major chapter in the history of the Star Wars galaxy, and it covers the stories of everyday people on a series of far-reaching but very not galactically significant adventures. Skeleton Crew is very self-contained, with no real cameos or tie-ins to other Star Wars stories. Its goal is to just tell a small story of its own. The Acolyte, meanwhile, is tied tightly to the overall mythos of Star Wars, dealing with stories of Jedi and Sith, and its story isn't nearly as self-contained. That isn't a bad thing, to be clear, but it means The Acolyte had a lot more story elements to keep track of than Skeleton Crew, and it didn't do so nearly as well. Skeleton Crew, impressively, didn't leave any loose ends at all. It completed its story, resolved all the different plot threads it had going, and kept track of everything it introduced. Perhaps more importantly, it avoided cluttering the story with potentially story-relevant details that end up going nowhere. The show adheres almost religiously to a writing principle called Chekhov's gun, according to which any story element that gets attention called to it should end up being relevant later down the line. For instance, if a character is shown to have a gun early in a story, that gun should go off before the story ends. This isn't a hard and fast rule, and when it comes to writing, a lot of rules are made to be broken, but regardless, Skeleton Crew does this a lot. There's the emergency hull demolition sequencer, which is mentioned in the first episode as part of what seems like a throwaway gag, only to come into play in episode 6. There's the turret on the roof of the school building on the Republic Mint worlds, which Neil is shown in episode 4 and uses in the finale. In episode 1, Fern is shown exploiting loopholes in her nanny droid's programming to get out of trouble. In episode 4, she uses the same trick to get crucial information out of SM-33. And there's Kim's emergency beacon, which she gives the kids in episode 3 and which they use in the finale. These are only a few examples out of many. The principle often plays out within episodes as well. The only time Skeleton Crew breaks this rule is a deliberate subversion of the trope, with the lightsaber from Tak Renard's horde. The show repeatedly makes you afraid that Jod's going to kill someone with it, but he never does despite threatening to and having the opportunity to do so, which is used to provide insights into his character. Again, this firm adherence to principle isn't necessary, but it was definitely satisfying to watch. The Acolyte makes an admirable effort on this front, and a lot of plot elements from the first few episodes that initially seem unexplained or underdeveloped are explained in the final few episodes. It's especially careful to avoid loose ends that could undermine the plot of The Phantom Menace, such as by murdering every Jedi who's aware of the Sith's return and giving the others a believable cover story. It does leave a lot of things hanging, however. Some of these elements were obviously meant as build-up for a second season, but it's been confirmed that the Acolyte isn't getting one, so now there are a bunch of elements of the show's stories that are just unresolved. Perhaps the most obvious is Darth Plagueis' brief appearance, but other examples include whatever the ulterior motives of Enestra Rojas, Kimir's true name and full backstory, and the exact nature of the Brendok Witch Coven. While it would have been better for more of these to have been addressed in the season we got, especially given how slow its first half was, it's impossible to say which of these were built up for a second season and which were just abandoned. Obviously, it wouldn't be a flaw if the intent was to address them later, but there isn't really a way to differentiate with these larger plot pieces. But there are plot elements that the Acolyte really does just kind of drop. Most notably, whatever the backstory was supposed to be with Basil, the tracker, in the last few episodes. It's completely unclear what he's trying to do and why. It's especially unclear why he sabotaged Sol in the finale, and that plotline is just kind of dropped. Basil just kind of vanishes after screwing over Sol with no explanation or follow-up. All that plotline really does, in any event, is ensure that Pip makes it into May's hands by the end. That didn't really need to happen anyway, so it's unclear why they didn't just kill Basil with pretty much everyone else in episode 5. Speaking of killing, let's talk about character deaths. We've been sharply critical of how many recent Star Wars series have played it fast and loose with character deaths, doing fake-out deaths or bringing characters back from the dead, and, in the process, diminishing the significance of death as a whole. Both Skeleton Crew and the Acolyte, however, are anomalies in this respect, and since we harp on about fake-out deaths so much, we figured we should give credit where it's due. The Acolyte not only doesn't hit us with any fake-out deaths, but it had no problem killing a significant portion of its main cast for real, and in some surprisingly gruesome ways. The writers of that show cut a bloody swath through their main cast, which is especially bold given they were clearly angling for a second season. Not even the show's best character, Master Sol, could escape the Reaper, and most of the less significant characters didn't even have a chance. It's at least one thing that the Acolyte's writers unambiguously did right. It means that there's a genuine sense of danger in the show. Particularly after the episode Night, in which so many characters die, there's a genuine sense that any member of the main cast could potentially be on the chopping block. That's an important element for building up tension and a sense that characters are really in jeopardy, and it's something that Star Wars projects sorely need more of. Of course, you don't have to take the Acolyte's approach of murdering half your main players in order to achieve this, as much as we respect the gutsiness of that approach. Skeleton Crew does an excellent job of building tension, making it seem like characters are genuinely in danger and making death mean something without massacring the cast. Skeleton Crew only kills one major non-droid character, Brutus, but it still gets you to feel like the kids are genuinely in danger of dying at certain points, and it accomplishes this in a few ways. The first and simplest is that it just takes death seriously. There are no fake-outs. Although there is one moment where some characters mistakenly think that another is dead, and death is established to be permanent and horrifying. Most of the characters are genuinely frightened of the dangerous circumstances they wind up in, which lends an air of seriousness to any threats they face. The light humor and general kids stuff with which the Skeleton Crew approaches most aspects of their adventure completely vanish when they're in serious danger. A tonal shift that also does a good job of creating a sense of danger. They're more vulnerable than most Star Wars protagonists are, which makes it easier to make them seem threatened, and more importantly, they know it. The last major component of how Skeleton Crew makes death and danger serious is how it portrays the people actually doing the killing. The show's very first scene shows that the series' pirates are ruthless and will not hesitate to slaughter people for money. Even if they aren't directly shown doing all that much killing going forward, the audience still knows that they wouldn't think twice about it, which allows them to remain a serious threat. But perhaps the most threatening character in the series is Jod, who is made into a threat in almost the exact opposite way. Up until the end of the series, it's left unclear whether or not Jod really is that ruthless. He does do some killing, namely of Brutus and the supervisor, and he carries out both murders without remorse and for his own personal benefit, but it's also clear that there's some shred of good inside him, and that part of him does care about the kids as much as he tries not to. This actually builds tension better when Jod threatens to kill the kids' parents, or indirectly threatens them with his lightsaber. We're completely unsure whether or not Jod will actually kill anyone, and that sense of uncertainty is, in a sense, scarier than knowing for a fact that he would. That ambiguity is a point of comparison in its own right, as both Skeleton Crew and the Acolyte have characters like that. On one hand, you have Skeleton Crew's Jod Nanawud, an enigmatic and extremely complex character who's mostly a bastard, but who has some shreds of good in him. On the other hand, you have the Acolyte's Kimir, or the Stranger, who's an attempt at a sort of sympathetic Sith, a ruthless murderer steeped in the dark side, to be sure, but also someone who can at least pretend to have traces of compassion. One works out a whole lot better than the other, in our opinion. While Manny Jacinto's performance was great, we found the writing for Kimir to be a bit of a mixed bag. His Kimir persona was perfect. The Weasley little evil sidekick who turns out to be the big bad wolf is a bit of a trope, but it works well and isn't super predictable in the Acolyte. The Sith Lord persona, on the other hand, was a bit more scattershot. Sometimes it seemed like he was genuinely meant to be ambiguous, at others it seemed like it was just an act, and sometimes the act was dropped entirely. Without the context of a second season, we don't have the full picture of this character, to be fair, but we can at least critique the moral ambiguity of his character. Episode 6 of The Acolyte, Teach/Corrupt, puts by far the most effort into trying to make Kimir an ambiguous character. Throughout this episode, it's clear that he's putting on an act to win over Osha, especially since being a Sith and having a sense of empathy are mutually exclusive, but not all of it is meant to be manipulation. Kimir's got scars, literal and metaphorical, and it's clear that he has a genuinely tragic backstory, with the implication being that he was Vanestra's former apprentice who she failed in some way. And even when he's being straight up evil in previous episodes, he does make an effort to justify his actions, claiming that he only wants the freedom to use his power the way he wants, end quote, and justifying his killings as more or less self-defense. The Jedi don't allow Sith like him to exist, and so he has to kill them to stay alive. We could be wrong, but we get the sense that this argument is meant to be at least considered or seen as more morally ambiguous, and in that respect, it fails. The problem with Kimir as an ambiguous character is, well, everything he does in the first 5 episodes. Most of what he does is just straightforwardly evil, and most of the rest can be easily dismissed as manipulation. His arguments in his own defense fall flat if given the slightest consideration too. He makes clear in the first episode that he wants to destroy the Jedi on an ideological level, which goes well beyond self-defense. And the numerous murders he commits or orders, for which he shows zero remorse, are an excellent example of why the Jedi are right that Sith like him cannot be allowed to exist. His emotionally scarring backstory, or at least what's implied of it, is a little sympathetic, but it does nothing to make who he is in the present anything less than straight up evil. Contrast with Jod Nanawud. Jod also has a tragic backstory, but not only does Skeleton Crew not rely on it to generate sympathy, but it also doesn't bring it up until close to the end of the finale, after it's already put in the hard work of making Jod a morally ambiguous character. Throughout the series, it's clear that Jod is definitely a greedy scumbag, but while it'd be a bridge too far to call him a scoundrel with a heart of gold, there's at least a few shreds of good in him. And it's also clear that this isn't an act. There's a sharp difference between Jod acting like a nice guy and Jod genuinely caring about the kids. The show sells it by having Jod act like he believes that there's no good in him, but demonstrating otherwise now and again in spite of himself. Once we finally learn his backstory, it all makes sense. But in broad strokes, it's apparent who Jod really is from early on. It's hard to tell what degree Jod's a scoundrel and just how much good is in him, but it's clear that both elements of him are genuine. More importantly, Jod's actions fall on both sides of the line. With Kimir, his ambiguity is almost all talk or blatant manipulation, and his actions are consistently evil, whereas with Jod, it's a real mix of both. A lot of what the kids initially believe to be Jod helping them is partly self-serving, but Jod does, for example, rescue the kids from a war zone on At Akron, and he tries to console Win when he gets homesick as well. Jod's a genuine mixed bag, full of internal contradictions, uncertainty, and history. In other words, he's deeply human, and that, more than anything else, is what makes his moral ambiguity believable. Speaking of ambiguity, let's go on a tangent for a bit and talk about episodes 3 and 7 of The Acolyte, Destiny and Choice. These episodes tell the same story from two different perspectives, with the second perspective completely changing the audience's understanding of events. Destiny presents the events that happened on Brendok as a story of Osha getting a chance to leave home and become a Jedi, only for May to start a fire and kill everyone to prevent her from leaving. The episode Destiny presents events to the viewer as if this were really what happened, although there's an important clue that there's more to the story, namely that all the bodies of the witches are suspiciously non-crispy. Choice reveals the truth, that a combination of misunderstandings and emotional attachment drove the Jedi on Brendok into a confrontation with the Coven. The Jedi killed pretty much everyone, albeit mostly in self-defense, and then used the fire to cover it up. In this, the series plays with subjective visual presentation, which is to say, showing the audience something that isn't meant to be taken as the literal truth, or that will be revealed to not have been the literal truth later. This is something that Star Wars has prominently done once before, namely in The Last Jedi. That film presents a sequence of 3 scenes that all depict the same event, namely the moment Ben Solo fell to the dark side. The first 2 depict Luke's sanitized version of the event and Kylo Ren's subjective version, while the third depicts the truth. But as that example shows, this sort of non-literal presentation needs to be done carefully, especially when the audience isn't expecting it. A lot of Star Wars fans remember this part of the story as Luke Skywalker trying to murder a kid in his sleep, when what the film actually presents as the truth is that Luke reflexively activated his saber upon sensing the presence of the dark side, only for Ben to wake up and take it the wrong way. This isn't entirely the viewer's fault. The shot of Luke standing over Ben with a murderous look on his face, saber active and raised for the kill, is one of The Last Jedi's most distinctive images, and it's more memorable than the scene that establishes that this is an image that didn't happen at all. Not to mention that this sort of subjectivity was something that Star Wars had never done before, and as a result, it wasn't something viewers knew to expect. The Acolyte doesn't hit that roadblock nearly as hard as The Last Jedi. Unlike The Last Jedi, it never presents a shot that is later established didn't happen. But like those scenes in The Last Jedi, the episode Destiny doesn't really do enough to clue the viewer in to the fact that it isn't telling the complete story, especially when the whole truth doesn't come out until the second to last episode of the series. It would have worked a lot better if that episode were presented clearly as Osha's subjective memories. In fact, if the material from Destiny was integrated into episodes 1 and 2 as flashbacks rather than made into a whole episode, that would have solved the subjectivity problem and improved the pacing greatly. But we digress, and it's time to get back to the comparisons. The Acolyte and Skeleton Crew also differ in their approach to the goofier parts of their respective stories. The pirates for Skeleton Crew and the witches for the Acolyte. Star Wars is no stranger to either of these concepts, nor to campy or goofy elements in general. In fact, we'd argue that it wouldn't really be Star Wars without the occasional bit of camp. But how it's handled is important. Sometimes it really works, sometimes it just falls flat, and sometimes it can go either way depending on the viewer. It's subjective, to be fair, but there are aspects of how it's presented that usually either help or hurt the story. The Acolyte's Witch Coven is perhaps the most infamous part of the series, if not necessarily for all the right reasons. Even among the show's defenders, this aspect of the series is often criticized, and for good reason. The witches are deeply campy, but the show plays them seriously, and at least in our view, it doesn't really work. The Coven is presented as if they're supposed to be mysterious, but there isn't really much of a mystery to them. Even their explanation of how they view the Force is very similar to Yoda's from The Empire Strikes Back, just with a new metaphor. There isn't all that much that's spooky about them, unlike with, say, the Night Sisters as presented in the Clone Wars. On the contrary, they come off as goofy at times, particularly during the third episode's ceremony. Episode 7 deals with the Coven better than Episode 3 by making them into a real threat for the Jedi, but they eliminate almost all of the camp in the process. It essentially walks back the original depiction of the Coven to make them a lot more Night Sister-like. Compare this to Skeleton Crew's pirates. While it's possible to do pirates seriously, Skeleton Crew embraces the campiness to the point of giving them a pirate code, sea shanties, and in SM33's case, pirate speak. It's silly at times, but the show understands this, and it intends it to be that way. It injects a touch of lightheartedness into the very real threat posed by the pirates. This matches the tone of Skeleton Crew as a whole, which is surprisingly dark at points, but which always maintains an atmosphere of fun. The show is serious, but it doesn't take itself too seriously, which is what allows its pirates to work. We're not sure whether the same approach would have worked for the Acolyte, which had a much different tone. It probably would have been better just to make the Coven more Night Sister-like and cut the camp altogether. But Skeleton Crew does show that the campiness can be made to work, at least in some contexts. As a quick final note, let's talk about world building. World building is extremely important to telling a good Star Wars story. A large part of the magic of Star Wars is how vast the universe is and how the world building of the films conveys that. This isn't entirely a writing thing. A lot of it is down to set design, VFX and the like, but there's writing involved, so we'll talk about it anyway. In broad strokes, good Star Wars world building requires creating imaginative settings that have a tangible sense of history and culture to them, and then filling those settings with life. The world built should also play well with other Star Wars media. It should feel appropriate for its place on the timeline, and it should feel like it's from the same world as other Star Wars projects. This is something that both Skeleton Crew and the Acolyte actually do exceptionally well. Skeleton Crew in particular really shines on the world building front. Its nature as a background story about the lives of everyday people instead of the galaxy's big players lends itself to fleshing out the world of Star Wars, and it does that phenomenally. It takes us to a variety of planets, but not to any of the galaxy's big destinations. With the exception of Borgo Prime, which is still fairly obscure, all of the worlds the characters visit are unique and new. There's the peaceful yet off-puttingly artificial secret world at Aden, the rowdy Port Borgo, the war-torn desolation of Ad Akron, lonely Observatory Moon, and the resort world Lanupa. Every single one is unique, has its own distinct atmosphere, and stands out among the many, many established planets in Star Wars lore. This gives us a look at a broad slice of galactic civilization, from the criminal underworld to the world of the wealthy and powerful, without retreading all that much old ground. Skeleton Crew makes the world feel bigger and more varied, and it does so in a way that contributes to the story. All of these planets except at Aden serve two story purposes. The first is to provide contrast with Ad Aden and allow the kids to experience what the outside galaxy is like. Borgo Prime and Ad Akron demonstrate the dangers of the galaxy, the wars and privation that Ad Aden has cut itself off from, but Lanupa and the Observatory Moon show the kids that there are also wonders in the galaxy that the people of Ad Aden are missing out on. These planets also help build a picture of the galaxy under the New Republic, painting a picture of an outer rim plagued by lawlessness and strife, but one that the New Republic and its allies are nonetheless working hard to protect and build up. It's a nuanced picture and one that adds extra texture not just to Skeleton Crew, but to all canon Star Wars stories set in the New Republic era. Skeleton Crew's excellent, layered world building not only adds flavor and additional meaning to its own stories, but to Star Wars as a universe, as it should be. The Acolyte also introduces a variety of new worlds, and it also brings us back to two that we've seen before, Coruscant and Karlak. Karlak, for those who might not remember, first appeared in Star Wars The Clone Wars. It was the tundra planet where the Death Watch was hiding out in Season 4. Coruscant, of course, needs no introduction. Unlike Skeleton Crew, which fleshes out every planet it visits, some of the Acolyte's planets are only seen briefly and don't add too much to the greater world building. This is the case with Karlak as well as for Ueda, the planet from the start of the series premiere. Nonetheless, even these planets that we see in passing are given their own distinct atmospheres, contributing to the sense of a large and varied Star Wars galaxy. The Acolyte's other planets make more significant story contributions. This is most obvious for Brendok. The nature of the planet, the witches that live there, and their fate is central to the story. The other worlds, meanwhile, mostly serve to give us a glimpse of what the galaxy was like at the end of the High Republic era. On Coruscant, we see Galactic City slightly less built up than in the films, and in general, it seems to be a livelier, more homely place, an indication of this golden age of the Republic that, by the time of the Phantom Menace, is pretty much gone. On Olega, meanwhile, we get a look at a more ordinary Republic world. It isn't as wealthy as Coruscant, but it's generally doing well, and notably, it houses a Jedi Satellite Academy, showcasing how the Jedi Order is more widespread during this period, as it was in the Old Republic era in Legends. Other planets give us a look at the frontier of the still expanding Republic. On Kofar, we see a planet where civilization is just beginning to establish a presence, and on the unknown planet where the Era's Sith make their home, which bears a striking resemblance to Baldemnik from the Darth Plagueis novel, we see a world entirely untouched by the Republic's influence. Like Skeleton Crew, the Acolyte gives us a broad look at the galaxy, giving us a better understanding of the world at this point in galactic history. Every planet that appears in the series is distinct and comes with its own sense of history and culture, and that maintains the all-important sense that there's a much bigger galaxy out there. One last aspect of world building is continuity, which bears mentioning for both of these series. Unlike a great many recent Star Wars series, both Skeleton Crew and the Acolyte adhere closely to established canon lore without creating retcons or other such nonsense. Skeleton Crew's self-contained nature meant that it wasn't likely to create retcons anyway, but the Acolyte went to pains to take other canon sources into consideration. It kills off or memory wipes any non-Sith with knowledge of the Sith's return, in a fashion similar to what Darth Bane, Rule of Two, did in Legends, and it also brought in many elements from the High Republic novels, such as the Great Hyperspace Disaster and the character of Vernestra Rowe. Not only did these two series play nice with canon, however, but they both also brought in storytelling elements from Legends. This is always a nice treat. Canon sources aren't required to stick to Legends lore, and the whole point of the new canon is to allow them to contradict Legends lore, so it's always nice when a writer goes out of their way to give a nod to the better continuity. In Skeleton Crew, this came in the form of the pirate port Borgo Prime, originally from one of the Young Jedi Knights novels, references to the Legends characters Dash Rendar and Crimson Jack, as well as a sneaky reference to the holiday special. The Acolyte gives us a very Legends-accurate depiction of Cortosis, and it also brought back Darth Plagueis' Legends appearance. These are small things, and not strictly matters of good writing, but hey, far be it from us to miss a chance to call attentions to Legends lore. So that's our look at the writing of Skeleton Crew and the Acolyte. As we said before, this wasn't a complete overview, so feel free to let us know if you'd like our full thoughts on either show. Aside from that, make sure you let us know what your thoughts about the show are in the comment section below, and as always guys, thank you so much for watching, and I hope to see you in the next video.